climate change communication. And you can see to my left is Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. Do you want to introduce yourself, Steve?
Yeah, hello everybody there. I'm Stephan Lewandowsky. I'm a professor in cognitive science at the University of Bristol, and I've been working with Adam on this project relating to uncertainty in climate science and how to communicate that.
Great, okay, thanks very much. Now what's going to happen is Steve's going to just seamlessly slide out of shot for a little bit because I'm going to be giving the presentation itself. But then that should run for about 30 minutes or so. And then both Steve and I will be available to take questions and to discuss afterwards. So just a little bit of background. I can hear someone's got something unmuted somewhere. There's lots of shuffling going on. Could be a participant somewhere. And it sounds like lots of people opening drawers. Okay, that's stopped now. Yeah, just a little bit of background, I guess, to this handbook and to the webinar today. The handbook is one output that's come out of a wider project which Steve has been involved in over a number of years now, which is to do with the role of uncertainty in climate change in general. And this has been funded partly by a grant from one of the UK research councils and partly by some funding associated with Bristol University. And so this is a collaboration between COIN and Steve, as well as Steve's colleague here at the University of Bristol, Mary Phillips, and the other person that's been involved in this handbook is Olga Roberts, who's not on the webinar today. And I think it's a kind of testament to the amount of interest there is in uncertainty communication and in climate change communication in general, that we've got people from such a wide range of backgrounds interested in the handbook and signed up to the webinar today. And we're going to run through the 12 principles that are in the handbook. And as well as that, we're going to try and make some links, I guess, to the wider context of climate change communication, because I think it's important to understand how to communicate uncertainty more effectively, but that communicating uncertainty is not a series of tricks that people should learn. It's just one part of the broader piece on climate change communication, and a part of getting our heads around the challenge collectively of engaging the public on climate change. So the handbook is really aimed at a wide audience. It could be useful for a climate scientist who wants to talk about their research, wants to do it in a concise way, but maybe is coming to the realization that the standard ways of communicating that people tend to be taught as scientists make for good science, but maybe don't make for amazing communication. It could be for someone who is going to a community that has been affected by flooding and they want to talk about the link between extreme weather and climate change. It could be for a campaigner who wants to get a really punchy, engaging message out there, but doesn't want to overstretch or exaggerate the science. But what we try to do is to condense down dozens of different academic papers into a format that hopefully is easier for non-academics and non-experts to engage with, a real sort of practitioner's guide to this area. And before I get into the principles themselves, it just feels worth stepping back a little bit, really, and to think, what's the motivation for this handbook in the first place, and to think about uncertainty in general, because it may not seem this way if your job involves climate change communication or maybe engaging with skeptical publics or politicians, but uncertainty is not something that's particular to climate change. It's something that we encounter all the time in our day-to-day lives, and we seem to manage okay. We figure out whether to bring an umbrella. We leave enough time to get to meetings. Most of the time, we navigate a very uncertain social world in a pretty successful way. And climate change is like any other complex body of science. Uncertainties are supposed to be there. They're the thing that drives scientific inquiry forward. They're not something to be pushed away and shoved under the carpet. And I guess our starting point with this handbook really is that in no way is it a good idea to be suggesting that the uncertainties of climate science are not there, but that perhaps we can be a bit smarter, be a bit more effective in the way that we communicate about uncertainty, because uncertainty is not, under any circumstance, a rationale or reason for inaction. I mean, if we had more perfect knowledge about climate change and we knew exactly what was going to happen, then I guess we could put in place policies and practices that would just about see off those risks, just about mitigate those risks. But because we don't have perfect knowledge, those uncertainties give us more of a reason to be concerned about taking greater action, not the other way around, which can sometimes seem the way that uncertainty is phrased, particularly by those sceptical of the need for climate change policies. So I'm just going to run through, as I said, there's 12 principles in the handbook altogether, and I'm going to just touch on each one of them in the next 25 minutes or so. And as I was just suggesting, uncertainties are everywhere, and people seem quite happy with them in many domains, in many different fields. But when it comes to science, there does seem to be a bit of a mismatch between what people expect from science and what science is actually like. And this is at least in part to do with the way that science is taught in schools, as a series of facts and figures, certainties. Many media publications take a similar kind of line. Relationships are direct and causal, when in fact most scientific knowledge is to do with probabilities. Things are more likely to happen or less likely to happen. But that's not the way that most people understand scientific knowledge to be. And there's a study up on the screen here by Anna Rabinovich and Thomas Morton, Exeter University, which investigated exactly this idea. And they found that in an experiment, when they tutored people beforehand about the sort of true nature of science, I guess, that it is an ongoing debate, that there will always be uncertainties. This doesn't mean that scientists don't know everything. It's not just a fixed body of facts. When people had that extra information, then they were more likely to be accepting and tolerant of uncertain messages in science. So it's about managing people's expectations from climate change science and from any body of science. Because uncertainty is around us so much, then it can be effective to use analogies to non-scientific areas where we do manage and deal with uncertainty successfully. But I guess probably the most important thing to take from this principle is that it's crucial to get over this misconception, I suppose, that the term uncertainty is associated in a lot of people's minds with the idea of ignorance, not knowing anything, when actually uncertainty for scientists is a bit like a volume knob, a volume dial, where you're more or less certain as you turn that dial, but it certainly doesn't mean that scientists don't know anything about the area. And linked to this, I guess, it sounds simple, but it's crucial that scientists and people who are using climate science start with what they know and not what they don't know. Being cautious and being tentative and being hesitant, these are really great principles and ways of doing science, but they're not really great ways of doing public engagement and doing communication. And there's a huge amount that is known about climate change. So, on the basic questions, what's causing climate change? Is it happening? Does it pose a range of dangerous risks if we don't do anything about it? On these questions, there's a huge amount of agreement. The science is effectively settled, and we shouldn't feel afraid of saying that, where we can be confident about particular aspects of climate science knowledge. So it's about not apologizing for gaps in knowledge first, before saying what you do know, but without at all suggesting that we should sweep away the issues that we don't know, but just focusing on what we do know first. And one of the ways of getting across the information of what we do know is to talk about the scientific consensus. So the graphic you can see on the screen, I'm sure you're all familiar with this idea that there's a very strong consensus among the scientific community on these basic questions about whether climate change is happening, whether human activity is causing it. And on the one hand, we know from a whole range of studies, not just on climate change communication, on other areas of science and how the public engage with those topics, that there isn't a straightforward relationship between how much people know about a subject and whether they care about it or think there should be policies to respond to the risks that the science describes. It, as I'll come to later, it has a lot to do with people's values and their political orientation and their worldviews. So it's not the case on the one hand that everyone needs to have their head filled up with hundreds of different studies about climate change and then that will be the key to unlocking climate change concern. But consensus seems to be different. It seems like it's a different kind of knowledge, and research that Steve and other people have conducted have found that when you emphasize and reiterate the fact that there is this very high level of scientific consensus on these basic questions, it acts a bit like a gateway belief. So if people accept that, or the extent to which they understand that there's this consensus, it has a knock-on effect of whether they're concerned about climate change, whether they support policies to deal with climate risks. And it's worth, I think, reflecting a little bit on why consensus information does seem to work in a way that other factual information maybe doesn't or hasn't been found to. And I think it's because there's something in the idea of a consensus that sends out not just information about the facts, but also powerful, what you might call normative information. People tend to defer to experts, to scientists, and a consensus statement is telling us something about what a group of experts think and how much they agree, and that's powerful information in the same way that people respond to social consensus around them as well. So other than scientists, you might expect the kind of people that would be good at communicating a consensus message would be peers, people that we consider to be like us in some way. And as I'll come to in a second, the extent to which we can plug these kinds of consensus statements into a wider dialogue and narrative about climate change that connects with different audiences' values and the things that they care about, then it's likely to be the most effective. So the fourth principle in the handbook is about making a subtle but potentially important shift from talking about uncertainty to talking about risk. And most people feel more familiar with risk, I think it's fair to say, than they do with the idea of uncertainty. So house insurance, health risks, national security risks, these are all quite common, familiar, everyday issues that people can maybe engage with more easily than they can with this slightly more alien term uncertainty, which has connotations of not knowing rather than degree of knowledge. And there's been a lot of discussion, particularly around media reporting, actually, of climate change, and even by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself, in shifting away from talking about uncertainties in climate science and towards talking about the risks that climate change poses, which is equivalent in terms of what the message is conveying, but seems to have a greater degree of familiarity. It's a kind of currency that people are more used to talking about risks rather than uncertainties. And this slide and the fifth principle that we have here follows on from that, I think, in that it's about different ways of framing messages, uncertain messages about different aspects of climate change, and a common strategy, I think, of skeptical arguments against climate change, whether that's the reality of climate change or taking action in response to climate change, tends to be to try and confuse the different aspects of climate change where you might come across uncertainty. So, for example, there's obviously going to be huge uncertainty around the predictions of exactly where regional impacts will occur in 50 years' time. But that doesn't mean that we're not very sure about the greenhouse effect underneath it. And what the examples on this slide are trying to get across is that there are better and worse ways of talking about uncertainties in these different aspects of climate change communication, which are just as defensible in terms of being accurate and truthful and honest, but the do-say line across the top is maybe a more effective way of getting the message across than the don't-say examples down the bottom, which feel to me like often they seem like the sort of go-to examples that scientists will often fall back on, apologizing for uncertainties before stating things that they do know. And in the example on the right, the don't say example of climate policies, that's a particularly interesting one, I think, because it's absolutely true that science can never tell us which policy is best. We can't read off social, political decisions from a scientific analysis of what the underlying risks are, and we shouldn't do that. But that doesn't mean that science has nothing to say about our policy choices. And I think that do-say example where we know how much more carbon we can burn if we want to limit the risks of climate change. Most of the world's remaining coal, oil and gas must remain in the ground. How to achieve this is a matter of political debate. It's not claiming that the science can tell us exactly what to do, but it's putting some pretty strong constraints there at the beginning about what the reality of climate risks are and how we ought to respond to them if we're serious about mitigating climate risks. So I said at the beginning that I think part of this handbook is to talk about how to communicate uncertainty, but part of it is to try and make links out to the wider issues beyond that particular focus, and to think what's the context for embedding and inserting better and worse ways of talking about uncertainty into a realistic situation. And I mentioned a few slides ago that really what is driving people's views about climate change is not how much they know, it is their worldview, their political beliefs, their values. So you find certainly in English-speaking countries that there is a strong relationship, a consistent relationship between being of the right politically, being conservative, and being skeptical about climate change. And more broadly, in non-English speaking countries, there's a similar type of relationship that has to do with a certain cluster of values. So people that tend to prioritize more self-focused values like authority and wealth, there tends to be a relationship with being skeptical about climate change, whereas people who prioritize things like altruism and concern for the welfare of others tend to be more engaged with climate risks. Now, these are really consistent findings, but the question is, what do we do about them? And at COIN, we've spent a good few years now asking exactly that question, not just accepting that people who tend to be more conservative tend to be more skeptical about climate change, but saying what can we do about it? Because the reason that's usually given for this relationship is to say that most of the language around climate change and the policies that it suggests, maybe government regulation of industry or interference into individual behaviours in people's everyday lives, these tend to be things that clash and threaten a more right-leaning conservative worldview. So is it possible to talk about climate change and climate risks in a way that resonates with those values rather than threatens and challenges them? And that's one example of this is what you can see on the screen, which has been drawn from one of our COIN reports that we've completed on this issue over the last couple of years. And you can see that we're trying to build a bridge with language between the values of the centre-right in the UK and kind of sustainability, climate change objectives. And on the face of it, this is not specifically about uncertainty communication, but it's important, I think, to understand that, as I said, uncertainty communication isn't a series of tricks that we have to perfect. It's about a toolbox of strategies that are informed by the psychology and social science evidence base, and that when we put them into practice, this is the kind of context that you'd be likely to use those kinds of techniques in. So this next principle, I think, speaks to a pretty universal tendency among most people, which is towards wishful thinking. So if there's a chance that something, that we're told that there's a chance that something won't happen, then it's comforting to think that in fact it won't. And if you look at the left-hand side box here, what you can see is something that I think is pretty typical for the way that future climate impacts and climate projections are communicated. You tend to get a uncertain outcome. So in this example, it's sea level rise between a minimum and a maximum amount, and the suggestion that this range, or somewhere within that range, will take place by a fixed point in time. So here by 2072. Again, research that Steve has recently completed has tried to find out whether there's a better way of communicating this kind of information. And so what you can see on the right-hand side is an alternative way of framing exactly the same information. But here, the uncertainty is shifted so that it's about when the predicted sea level rise will take place. The uncertainty is about timing. And there's now a certain outcome that's predicted to happen between a certain time frame. So what this does is to make it clear that it's not a question of whether this climate impact is going to happen. We know that it will. It's just a question of when it happens between a minimum and a maximum time. And what Steve's found in his research is that this produces more positive responses to questions about support for government policies that would help to mitigate these risks. So there's just it's quite a new finding, and there's more research to come to try and confirm that. But it seems like a promising way quite a simple way of reframing uncertainty information around climate impacts that could have really quite practical implications for organisations like the IPCC. Now, sticking with the IPCC, they tend to, as well as using examples such as on the previous slide about uncertain outcomes, they also tend to use a set of standard probability phrases. So they might say that a certain impact is very likely to take place, or that human activity is very likely responsible for most observed warming that we've seen. And they define these phrases, which is fine, and they use them in reports, which they obviously need to be precise and clear for people. But what research has found, some that I've been involved with and other people as well, is that people respond very differently to these kinds of probability phrases. So what one person thinks very likely means or very unlikely means can be very different to what someone else means. And that's obviously a problem if we're trying to convey some kind of sense of a shared understanding of what these kind of risks are. So while that kind of information obviously needs to be there, and there'll be no reason to get rid of it altogether, it can also be useful to supplement that kind of communication approach with anecdotes, personal stories, visual images, artists' impressions that can really bring that kind of statistical phrase to life, because most people don't deal with this kind of information. Most people are not scientifically trained. They are storytellers. They respond to powerful images, and so creating a sort of vivid mental model in people's minds is really crucial. And that's, as I say, not to replace accurate scientific descriptions of risks, but to supplement them so that they go together. So the ninth principle from the Uncertainty Handbook has to do with thinking about the positives of uncertainty, and I think this has sort of two interpretations really. Firstly, a lot of climate change communication historically has tended to focus on the negatives and on the sort of doom and gloom angle, and it's been criticised for that, and I think fairly so. And what the box on the left you can see is a summary of an experiment that was conducted to see whether different ways of framing the same risk information, either positively by saying if we act now we can avoid a negative outcome, or negatively by saying if we fail to act this is what we've got coming to us, but the very same probabilities involved. They're probabilistically equivalent. Which one do people respond best to? And in this study, they found that a positive framing of uncertainty, generating that idea that there's an impetus for action rather than that we should be paralyzed into inaction, was a more effective strategy. People engage with that more positively. But there's another way as well, I think, where the positives of uncertainty come into it, which is that we're never going to have perfect knowledge about climate change. And even our climate policies, there'll be a great deal of uncertainty too. But there are a huge number of really positive co-benefits that will come about through building a low-carbon society. And that's what this cartoon on the screen is getting at. Cleaner air, better health outcomes, more energy security through renewable energy resources. These are all things that would be good anyway, and we probably wouldn't need to be 100% certain of anything to want those things to come about. So it's important just to step back from this sometimes and think that relationship between uncertainty and the future cuts both ways. This is something that we've touched on a little bit already. And I think it does feel like it's one of the areas where uncertainty communication is really starting to be thought about carefully now. People who are having to deal with climate impacts or who are involved in trying to engage communities who've been affected by climate impacts or will be affected by climate impacts in the future. And I think there's growing evidence that people are starting to join the dots between extreme weather and climate change, and to understand that this is the kind of thing that scientists have been predicting will happen. And attribution science, which is the science that estimates the extent to which any particular weather event was caused by climate change, or how much more likely it was made to happen because of climate change, is developing, and it's developing quickly, and it's starting to provide more and more accurate answers. But, of course, it is true that we're never going to be able to give an easy, simple, quick, real-time causal link between a particular event and climate change. And in a sense, that's actually asking the wrong question, because we can ask whether this particular flood or whether this particular heat wave was caused by climate change. But actually, it's about these types of weather events becoming more likely and becoming more likely to be bad and severe when they do occur. So it's like, for example, the link between a weak immune system and any particular illness that someone might experience. It's made the probability of that illness happening more likely, and it's made it more likely to be worse because the body's defense systems are down. So keeping the focus at that level rather than on whether one individual event was caused by climate change is better. But I think another side to talking about climate impacts and the uncertainty around them effectively is providing a kind of ongoing narrative about this relationship, so that it's not the case that when someone or a community experiences a flood or some other climate impact that suddenly everyone's saying, oh, well, this was caused by climate change. It's probably not the best time to talk to people about it then, necessarily. Communities might not want to, and they might not be expecting it. But if more conversations about climate change and what we can expect to see from climate change in the future happen when there aren't extreme weather events, and this provides a bit more of a natural baseline on which to build engagement around climate impacts when they do occur. So we're getting towards the end of the 12 principles now, and this one really, again, it's not so much a principle of uncertainty communication as thinking about the context in which uncertainty communication is going to occur. It can be difficult, especially if someone disagrees with you, but it's always better to have a conversation than it is to have an argument. And it's always better to have a conversation and a dialogue than it is to just send out a message, a kind of one-shot pamphlet or a speech or something like that, where for sure you can try and apply all of these principles of uncertainty communication, but it makes a lot more sense when it's embedded in a dialogue and you can have a bit of back and forth. And what you can see on the screen here is just an example of how to embed some of these principles that we've been talking about using using analogies, talking about the consensus, making it kind of personal and tangible for people, how to embed these in a conversation about climate change. And this is, it kind of pulls it all together, really, I think, this final principle. And it's about making sure that while we acknowledge that climate change is grounded in scientific knowledge and that most people now accept that it is a scientific reality, for most of us, most of the time, certainly for most people who don't work in climate change, in the field of climate change, it's not really yet a social reality. It's not there in the everyday world around people. There's very little in the way of cues and signals to say to people that this is such a major problem, that there are these enormous risks coming down the line. But there's also not very much in the way of inspiring human stories about how we can respond to climate change. And again, studies have shown that when people are engaged in climate solutions and they identify with those goals, they no longer are obsessing quite so much about the underlying uncertainties of the climate science, because what they're inspired by are those stories and the solutions, not the underlying science itself, and not whether it's certain or uncertain. And I think it's just always worth reminding ourselves that probably the single biggest uncertainty here is how we collectively respond to climate risks, what we decide to do, and how we decide to get there, and that is fundamentally a human story as well as a scientific one. Okay, so I think we've got to the end of what we wanted to present, but now we've got about 25 minutes. About 20 or 25 minutes to take questions, and I think what's been happening is that we can see a chat box. So if you do have any questions to send through, then by all means do that now. I don't know if anyone's sent any through already.
Not yet.
But if you do have any questions, send them through. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, you can download the handbook from the Climate Outreach website. And if you want to find out more about the work that we do, then you can go to the Climate Outreach website or Steve's blog, Shaping Tomorrow's World, and the website addresses for those at the bottom of the screen there.
Okay, I'm just monitoring the question box here.
Mm-hmm. And if there's no questions, then no worries.
Okay. Oh, okay. So the question is there's the first question here, and that is how organizations can use this learning. You want to?
Okay. So the question is, and I don't know whether you want to put any more detail on that, but in terms of kind of organizations applying these principles, I think there's always going to be, even though I think this handbook takes quite a big step away from the academic research itself, to try and make sure that you can see how to sort of action some of the conclusions from the academic research. It's obviously another leap again to actually do that in practice. And as I said, I think one of the places that these conversations are happening and are taking place is for people involved in community engagement around adaptation. And I do think that there's quite a lot in here that can be pretty directly applied, thinking about how to talk about the links between extreme weather and climate change. And sorry, I'm reading from two screens at once.
Yes, okay. Well, there's a couple of questions coming in, and maybe I'll take the next one,
sure.
and we'll take turns now, Adam and I, to deal with those. The next question was, one problem I've encountered is when people who are Christians tell me the world is only 6,000 years old. Where do I go with these people? Now, that's a very good question. Religion is obviously a major component in the lives of many people that affects them a great deal. And my response to that would be that we've recently had the papal encyclica, which made it very clear that to the Pope, at least, there is an obligation, a moral obligation, a stewardship to look after the planet. And I haven't read that document myself, but I know some people who have and who were extremely impressed by its intellectual and moral depth and how well thought out that was. And I would have thought that that is the easiest way, I think, to respond to people whose objection to doing something about climate change is based on religion. We now have the Pope. We, in fact, have the Muslim community, Islamic community that also came out with very strong statements about the need to do something about climate change, and I believe the Anglicans, the Church of England, has a similar explicit position on that. So to my mind, whether people think the world is 6,000 years old or 12,000 or 8 billion, it doesn't really matter. If they're Christian or religious, then there's a lot of religious response to climate change that's out there, and I would point to that.
Yeah, I think I can probably take the next one, which is can we speak to the approach of using entertainment communications to present the topic of climate change to the public and to model positive behaviour changes that the public can take on and adapt to adapt and build resilience? I think that's a really good question, and it kind of goes back to this idea on that final slide there, which is that it is a small minority of people that don't accept the science. Most people acknowledge that climate change is real, so they acknowledge it's a scientific reality, but it isn't there in our social lives. Even those of us who are really heavily engaged in climate change, or we maybe work in that field, who can honestly say that it makes much of an appearance in their lives outside of the office or outside of maybe any kind of campaigns and interest groups that they're involved in. You don't really see it in films or music or popular culture. So I think that idea of just trying to, as I said, it's important to communicate the science effectively, uncertainty effectively, but there's a wider project as well, which is to try and communicate climate change through, I guess, cultural channels as well as through scientific channels. And the example that Steve just raised is another example of that. Through religious networks, it's about building the sense that this is something important, that different groups can have different things to say about why it's important, but there's this shared collective challenge that we're all working to address, whether it's people of faith, whether it's someone who's at a cultural event or part of a cultural group. Climate change has relevance for all of those things, and there's 1,000 different ways to engage with climate change, but at the moment we're seeing it come through in quite a relatively restricted way, I think. So absolutely agree that seeing it more in our cultural channels, and whether that's the classic is something like in soap operas. When an issue has really arrived in the public consciousness, when there's a storyline about it. In the national soap operas, and I think the point at which we get to that of climate change would be a very positive thing.
Okay, well, the next question sort of connects with soap operas. It's how important is it that the media act on these lessons? What can be done to encourage journalists to take these lessons on board? I think I'll volunteer for that one because, the media are a bit of a soap opera when it comes to climate change. In my view, and in fact in the view of a lot of researchers who've looked at the media coverage of climate change and found it to be, less than adequate, in large part because they're overrepresenting fringe opinions from people who take issue with the laws of physics. So what can be done for the media to take these lessons on board? Well, my experience has been that, notwithstanding what I just said about the media coverage, that there are individual journalists who are very intelligent intelligent, extremely interested, very curious, who would like to know more about climate change and who are willing to pick up those lessons. And I try at every opportunity that presents itself to work with journalists like that and to try and get the message out. And I would suggest that if any of you have links to journalists who are of that type, then I think you will find them to be quite receptive to those messages.
I think this is a suggestion. It was really a question to put back out to everyone as well, and obviously to answer in your own time if you'd like to. But just to say that the handbook has had over 4,000 downloads, which is great, and so clearly there is an interest in this resource and these issues. It would be great to know, and I think actually the next question does speak to this a bit, but it would be great to know what aspect you find the most useful, so that we can make sure that if we're doing similar things in the future, we can focus on that aspect, and maybe just linking to that next question. Somebody has said about the do say, don't say principles being really useful, and whether we could suggest a longer list of those. So that's certainly something we can take on board and think about. And it's just, I mean, in a sense, the exact examples in there are not so much the main point as the approach. It's a kind of just a subtle way to try and reframe messages so that they are likely to either get people's attention or keep people's attention or not completely switch them off. And I think, again, it's something I've said a few times already, but it isn't just a series of tricks to throw out there, and none of these things on their own is suddenly going to be the difference between someone who's not interested at all on climate change and someone who completely gets it and wants to do something about it. But these are better and worse ways, like a toolbox that you can pick from, depending on what the applied situation is, I think.
Okay, well, I might take this question here that just came in because it happens to be close to my research area, and that is, the person says, I've recently undertaken a Future Learn web course about uncertainty and complexity in the world. They introduced agent models which modeled how change happened between people in a city. Much was about people we associate with that influenced our thinking. Do you think the recent shift in belief about climate change has come from just more people talking about it, which in turn increases media interest, or has some critical information made a difference? So that's a long question. Let me just briefly address it in parts. First of all, the agent-based model idea, which is something that I do as well. Those are computer simulations in which we create little autonomous agents, quote unquote, little electronic creatures that don't actually exist in physical space, but they have an electronic identity, and they talk to each other, and they have simple behavioral and intellectual rules built into them, and you can model the community of these little agents or creatures, and you can then draw inferences from that about how things might happen in society at large among people. And some of the insights you get from agent-based models are, in fact, quite striking and quite interesting. And yes, it is certainly the case that people learn from each other, and they learn from each other's actions. They learn from talking to each other, and there are data to suggest that, in particular, when it comes to climate change, people tend to rely on their friends and family as one of the sources of information. And in fact, in the data that I'm familiar with, they rely on those people more than they rely on scientists or the media or the government. Mm-hmm. So the immediate neighborhood of people is what is very crucial. Now, what follows from that, of course, is that any kind of conversation that you have with your neighbors or family or whatever can contribute to that process of getting information out into the community. for people to have a conversation. And in the same way that people also model behaviors of others. Everybody wants to be some sort of Crocodile Dundee character and be independent and this rugged individualist, but in reality, we're not like that at all. In reality, all of us do what the neighbors do. I can never remember when I have to put the rubbish out, what day of the week it is, because it changes with every public holiday. So I look at what the neighbors do, and that's when I put my rubbish out. And, you know, in that case, it's very explicit, but in other cases, I'm sure that I'm influenced by what everybody else is doing for a very good reason. And that is that most often, if you do what everybody else is doing, you're doing the right thing. You tend to line up for the correct lineup. If you don't know where to go because if everybody else is lining up to get tickets to the movies, well, probably that's where you want to go because people have, you know, others have figured it out. And those processes are important to recognize and understand and to make use of. And that's why it's so important, I think, for all of us to be engaged in conversations at all times.
I mean, just to quickly add to that as well, that I think another argument for why conversations about climate change are so important and can be so powerful is that it's been found several times in different countries as well that people tend to well, firstly overestimate the proportion of people who are skeptical about climate change, and people also tend to underestimate how much support there is for things like wind farms and other forms of renewable energy. So it's this kind of idea of like a social influence, the influences you make about other people's beliefs, and if most of the time we just don't talk about it, then that's a vacuum which can easily be filled by those kinds of misconceptions about what other people think, can be swayed by people who want to shout the loudest, which can often be more skeptical voices. So I think just breaking that climate silence, social silence that surrounds climate change is really, really crucial. I was just going to pick up on... I'm just skipping through the comment box. There was a question someone sent in about the one useful thing in the handbook was around human stories to use in workshops and presentations. And I think there are resources out there already, and gradually these resources are building up. So one example is there's something called Project Aspect, which if you Google that, it's a set of sort of digital stories, films that people have made about how climate change has affected their lives. And there is actually a resource on Talking Climate, www.talkingclimate.org, which is one of COIN's project websites at the moment, which has got a resource around climate storytelling, people's examples of people's stories that's out there. But there's no substitute, I think, for just actually asking people, just doing a basic bit. If you're an organization that wants to communicate with a particular community or audience, there's nothing more useful you can do than just speaking to a few people first, understanding who they are, where they're coming from, what their values are, the things they care about, how they engage with the world at large, as well as how they engage with climate change, and just their thoughts about how climate change might be affecting the world around them. And I think you'd be surprised that people have maybe more to say about that than maybe many of us suspect. It's just that most of the time they don't really get asked. Do you want to go for that?
Okay. I had one down here. Sorry, that I have. Oh, right. Yes, that one, because I kind of thought about this as you were speaking. The question is, climate change tends to be spoken about predominantly by just big green NGOs. Do you think they generally get it right with regards to uncertainty, but in general too? I think that's a very interesting point, and the reason I want to take up this issue because there was a recent controversy a couple of days ago when Emma Thompson, who is a celebrity, for reasons I don't know celebrities generally. She's an actress,
yeah.
But also she is, an activist for Greenpeace. She was interviewed on BBC radio or TV, and she said that temperatures might rise by 4 degrees Celsius by 2030. And she got slammed by the Daily Mail, by the UK Met Office. One of their people was cited at length in the Daily Mail because that was alarmist and impossible and whatever. It was wrong. Now, what was interesting, the reason I bring this up is what was interesting there is that the person from the Met Office who criticized her had himself authored a paper where he said we might hit 4 degrees as early as 2060, although his best estimate was 2070. Now, Emma said 2030 on TV. So is this now wrong? And if so, and of course, yes, it was wrong at some point, but would it be better to describe that as just being off by 30 years? Now, it seems to me that given the consequences of a 4-degree world, which are, you don't want to contemplate those consequences because the refugee crisis that we're currently experiencing in Europe is going to be a tea party compared to what happens under 4 degrees with millions of displaced people. So given those consequences, my question is, what's more important? Is it the basic fact that we have a serious problem, or is it that Emma Thompson was wrong to say 2030 and should have said 2060? And to my mind, I think, you want to get things right. So saying 2030 is not correct, but I would point out that it was only off by 30 years. And that given the consequences, I think that is less of an issue than somebody who goes up and says, oh, well, we don't have anything to worry about. Climate change doesn't exist. I mean, that's not even wrong. So what follows from that? Well, my experience with NGOs is green NGOs. My experience has been that they sometimes are off. They, by a decade or whatever, or they're exaggerating things slightly. That has happened. I've seen that happening. But to be honest, I have not seen a green NGO being wrong in principle on climate change. And that, to me, is very important. They're, in principle, they are correct about the science and about the fact that we face a problem, at least in my experience. I would not rely on a green NGO to deliver my science to me. I would rather look at the literature itself and get my information from there. But I'm not convinced that they are qualitatively wrong in what they say when they say that we have a problem. Mm-hmm. I think that's been my experience.
I mean, there's a question just beneath it which says about extreme weather events. Will affected communities relate more easily to climate change immediately, or will they resort to defense mechanisms like after Superstorm Sandy, or is that a separate issue? No, I don't think it is a separate issue, and I think this actually does follow from the previous point about big green NGOs maybe being the ones that are first, if they were to be the ones who were doing the communication with an affected community. They're great at the stuff that they do and talking to a particular audience, but there's plenty of room for other people to be in on this conversation as well. And the best people to be engaging a community that's been affected by extreme weather around climate change. As I say, it's important to be building that narrative and that story before it happens, so that it's not doesn't seem like someone's then turning around and saying, oh, suddenly climate change is part of this mix. But the best people for doing that engagement should be people who are already known and trusted by that community themselves. And that concept of sort of peer-to-peer communication, particularly when a community is feeling under stress and distressed from something traumatic that's happened, is going to be all the more important. Just really, really quickly, there was another comment beneath that, which is about not just human stories. It isn't what about a story about how climate change will impact on biodiversity. And I guess just to kind of clarify, when we say human stories, I think that's shorthand for just telling an engaging story that connects with people, that doesn't just sort of sit on the dry science, that breathes a bit of life into it around the things that people care about, the things that they love and they want to protect from being damaged from climate change. So for many people that could be biodiversity and nature and certain animal species. But I guess in that sense, it still is it's telling a human story about them and the things they care about is the point really to take from that, I think. Got a few minutes left.
Yeah,
now lots of questions.
Gosh, yeah. Well, maybe I should take the one on the last one for me, because we'll have to wrap up in about 3 minutes, and maybe you can pick another one, Adam, while I answer this one. The question is by somebody who says, I know people who say the 97% consensus is a myth. Articles published in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere have disputed the academic studies that claim to identify it as consensus. How would you recommend engaging with someone who's starting from this level of skepticism? Okay, well, that's a serious issue, and it's a very good point. And yes, the evidence for the consensus is being disputed, and it's being disputed for the simple reason that the consensus is extremely important psychologically and from a communicative perspective. We know from by now a fairly good, solid number of studies that telling people about the scientific consensus does make a difference to them. And some people have identified the perception of the scientific consensus as a gateway belief. That it's the belief that is opening people up to supporting policy measures to deal with climate change. So it is a crucial belief, and it is a crucial fact. Now, it is a fact beyond any doubt that there is a pervasive scientific consensus. Anybody who claims otherwise is either ignorant or is pursuing an agenda to distort the reality. And I'm absolutely, if there's one thing I know, it's that. Because unlike some of the people who dispute the consensus, I actually attend meetings of the American Geophysical Union, and there's 20,000 attendees at that conference, and when I'm there, no one is debating the existence of climate change among those 20,000 scientists that represent the entire scientific community in that discipline. So there's absolutely no question that the consensus is pervasive and widespread. How do you engage people who dispute the consensus? Well, it's difficult because they probably will dispute anything you say as well. However, what you can do for the benefit of others who might be listening is, first of all, to point out that undermining a consensus is a long-standing strategy of the tobacco industry and any other campaign that's ever been launched against a well-established scientific proposition. There's a wonderful book called The Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes that is very much worth reading. It's now been turned into a film, also called The Merchants of Doubt, that illustrates the strategies of political interests who wish to prevent policy action. And what they do is they always target a consensus, trying to pretend that there is a scientific debate when in fact there is none on that particular issue. And that is important to realize, that the attacks on the consensus are not made in good faith. They're made by people who have ideological or vested interests in undermining that. And it is very clear that if you look at the scientific literature, if you look at the statements by all scientific organizations in the world, everybody who knows anything about the laws of physics will say, yes, of course the climate is changing from greenhouse gas emissions. We've known that for 150 years. The science of climate change is 150 years old. It was in 1859 when Tyndall discovered that CO2 has thermal properties. Now, if that were wrong, that discovery, then airplanes wouldn't fly and all of modern physics wouldn't work, because it is a fundamental fact of physics. And it's just ridiculous to say, climate change is a hoax. Well, no, it's 150-year-old physics. And that's maybe something that's worth pointing out to people who would otherwise be unconvinced.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time. I'll just do one really quick answer to one final, which I'm just sort of plucking from the list, I'm afraid. Sorry to anyone who we didn't answer the question on the webinar. There's a question that's asked, is there a problem that we keep talking about a 2-degree warmer world, and to most people that doesn't seem like much? Yes, I think that is a problem. We have found in our own research at COIN, a project that we're working on at the minute, in fact, supporting that not only does 2 degrees sound quite nice, and it would have been nice if our summer was 2 degrees hotter, that when you, even when you kind of introduce the concept of what 2 degrees means, most people have absolutely no awareness of it. And why should they in some ways? Because it's kind of a meaningless metric to most people. And I understand why it's come about, and it has potentially been useful as a kind of measure and a metric for policy makers to coalesce around and to use as a benchmark to try and bring people who are really reluctant to engage with climate change from different nations around the world into the conversation. But I think even if it has been useful for that, the mistake that's been made is to think that that is somehow the end of the story, and that we can talk about a 2-degree warmer world. And actually that's the absolute bare minimum beginning of the story. The much more interesting question is, what does that mean? You know, what kind of world is that? And I'll be prepared to accept the risks that come along with a 2-degree world, or more or less. And what kind of choices can we make to shape that future society? And I think the more that we can do to sort of almost wrestle climate change away from the grasps of a very technical framing of the problem, and the idea that something like a 2 degrees target is somehow a solution. The more that we can do to build that social reality around climate change and connect with diverse audiences and their values, then the more chance of successful engagement we'll have.
Okay, and I think we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for the very
great
interesting questions. Yeah. Very good questions, and they're sorry we can't get around to answering them all, but anyway, we'll be around, and we can be contacted by email, and download the handbook, and stay tuned. There may be more stuff forthcoming.
Thanks very much for listening. Cheers.
Okay. Take care. Bye.